like my Monday today, so I'm having a case of the Mondays, forgetting to do things like recording. All right, so last time we talked in our little groups about, well, I guess in this class we talked as a big group about what purpose and meaning might look like differently at adolescence, early adulthood, late adulthood, and how it's important to be engaging in meaningful activities. So with that, let's talk specifically about purpose. So purpose and meaning are different again in just a really specific sense. Things that are meaningful are things that are important to you. You might have goals related to them. Purposes are things that you are doing and interacting with people beyond yourself. So if you have a purpose in life, let's say your purpose is your family, you might have long and short-term goals around your family, as well as it's meaningful to you and it's beyond just you. It's important. You're doing things for other people. Basically, you're doing things for others. So that's what purpose is. That's how it's different than meaning. So purpose is actually something that we've looked at, or I've looked at in relation to heroism. So I research purpose, I research heroism, I think about, well, how might these go together? Or other things that I research, wondering how it connects with heroism. So what's purpose got to do with heroism? Let's talk about that really quickly. Am I sharing? Nope, I'm not sharing. Oops, sorry about that. Again, Mondays. So what does purpose have to do with heroism? Well, it looks like in looking at the lives of heroes, we can find kind of true trajectories of how purpose is related to heroism. One is that a purpose in someone's life might lead them to be prepared to act heroically in a situation that calls for it. Another is that doing something heroic might lead someone to gain a purpose in that area. Because heroism, again, the definition of heroism, I mentioned it a couple times through class. Heroism is an action that benefits other people at risk to the self. So saving someone from a burning car, you're risking your own health, your own safety to protect the people in that car to help that person. Whistleblowing on an organization that's doing harmful things, usually this is like an organization that you work for or work within. So let's say it's a business. So you whistleblow on a financial organization that's doing illegal things. Well, you're at risk of being fired. Sorry. And this is why I have the cough drops. So you're at risk of being fired. You're at risk of being blackballed in the industry. You're even at risk. A lot of whistleblowers have been physically attacked. So this has happened with multiple financial institutions essentially trying to facilitate, which I actually find really interesting, that some of these financial institutions try to facilitate the murder or the assassination of some of these whistleblowers in such a roundabout way because they don't want it tied to them. But it is surprising to me that they haven't been more successful at completing that assassination. Yeah, I don't know. I'll have to look at the research to see, because that's a hard thing. If they're trying to make it look like an accident or something like that. Anyway, sorry, tangent. New area of research to look into, seeing how many times that might have happened, and as someone was prepping to whistleblow, but then they died under suspicious circumstances. Sorry. Anyway, purpose and heroism. So you can either have purpose and lead you to act heroically, or if you do something heroic, it might lead you to developing a purpose. So let's talk about Oscar Romero, a really good example of having a purpose and that leading to heroism. So very early on, Oscar Romero had some really clear goals: to be in the seminary, to be ordained a Catholic priest. This interest started very young, even at age 13. He had journals and writings where you can see that he felt like this was something important to him. It was meaningful. He had these long-term goals. And in this area, he developed a purpose. His purpose was kind of twofold: one to the deity that he was following, and another was to the people that he was serving. So I'm not going to read this whole quote from him, but he talks about the nucleus of my life is to witness and to serve, essentially. And so that way of saying that, the nucleus, he's really talking about a purpose. So like the central core aspect of himself was purpose driven, and it drove short-term goals, long-term goals. With this, he started working with the working poor in San Salvador, realized their plight. He opposed the government support and the situations and contextual socio-political factors there of the government supporting the wealthy ruling landowners and putting the poor down. So at this time, though, he didn't really do anything out of his lane. He was still really focused on just his church work, his ministry, and he would do things within there to help the people and support the people, but he didn't really do any steps outside of that. This changed when one of his mentors was assassinated because of their political activism. So they were giving really public speeches denouncing the things that the government was doing, being more active in supporting the working poor in the area. And this became a turning point for Romero. So that purpose prepped him, put him in this position, this situation where he had the capacity now to help other people in a larger way than he might have been if he hadn't been following this purpose. So essentially, he had built these talents, skills, and networks up to this point. He had a purpose for helping people, defending the poor, and he essentially transitioned that to something that was very risky for him. So before this, he wasn't really taking many risks. He didn't support the government, but he didn't really do anything against the government. And so at this time, he started essentially to be a whistleblower and to directly help the poor. So you can listen to things like sermons and read journals of what he was doing. Essentially, that purpose was still there. It was still the same motivations, but now the actions he was taking were more directly putting himself at risk as he was helping people more directly. So more direct action, you could say, in this case. So because of that direct action he was taking, he was actually assassinated while officiating a mass because of the things that he was saying. So a really clear example of having this purpose over time, and that purpose being really clear early on, and it led to when he had the possibility or the situation come up where he might be able to act heroically, he did because of that purpose. So that's one way purpose can take and be related to heroism. You can have that purpose. Then if you have a situation that arises where heroism is required, it can prep you for heroism. Another route is doing something heroic and then building a purpose off of that. So this is Miep Gies. She and her family were the ones who hid the Frank family during World War II. So when she was 23, she was fairly young, not really politically active. She didn't really she opposed Hitler, but wasn't like politically active. She wasn't doing direct action, essentially. She was just kind of going along with the flow, kind of keeping her head down, that kind of thing. But she was at that time already working under Otto Frank, the father of the Frank family. And when everything started happening during World War II, the Frank family asked Miep Gies and her family to hide them. So this was not like she went to them and said, hey, we're going to hide you. They came to her. So basically her boss coming to her saying, hey, we need help. She understood the risks. Her family understood the risks. They knew that they would be at risk of being killed themselves if they helped, but they helped anyway. So they took this heroic action. They weren't that heavily involved in politics or direct action, like I was saying. She didn't have a purpose at this point. She was just helping this friend, this family's that was there. And so it was very heroic. What she did, and then continued to do with more people after this, saved a lot of people's lives. So with this, as she started being more active, doing more direct action, she had these long-term goals to keep people safe and short-term goals like, hey, I have to get these people food. I have to watch out for raids and things like that. So long and short-term goals, it was meaningful. She saw how it helped people. So over time, she developed a purpose. So she took this heroic action in being asked to help, and that heroic action later developed into a purpose where she kept helping people through World War II and throughout the rest of her life. So she developed a purpose after her heroic action. So again, she was in a situation that called for heroism. She did act heroically. After doing that, she started to develop a purpose. So that's kind of the two paths that purpose and heroism seem to take. Is that either your purpose might lead you to do heroic action when the situation calls for it, or you do something heroic, and that then leads you to a purpose. This is something I see with a lot of the whistleblowers I interview as well, is they never really had I'll say this, they didn't have a sense of like going into an industry to like break it down. That wasn't their purpose in going into it. They were working, they were learning, they always had a strong sense of maybe right and wrong, or being ethical, but they didn't go into like the financial industry, for example, to tear down a bank. But as they were working under basically a conglomerate of banks, they would realize the unethical actions. They would then say, hey, this isn't right. We shouldn't be doing this. They would go up the different steps of the ladder, like talking to HR or talking to their manager or the manager about that. And over time, once the people realized, both those higher ups and as well as these whistleblowers realized that this wasn't going to go away. The person wasn't going to be quiet. They weren't going to be bought off. They were going to try and do good. They would fire them, try and attack them, a lot of different things. So these individuals, they didn't go in like with the goal to whistleblow, but a lot of them now have become activists, have tried to help and support and change laws and change regulations to help other people who are trying to do ethical things and change the system in different ways. So by Giraffes Heroes Project, for example, is one good one. The Speak Up, Speak Out Foundation is another good example of that. Basically, after doing those heroic actions, gaining a purpose in that specific area. So it's something that we see pretty commonly, is that purpose can lead to heroism, but heroism can also lead to people developing or changing their purpose in life. So that's actually more than I had intended to talk about this research, but it is some of my favorite research, so I kind of got on a tangent with it. But yeah, essentially, a hero might develop a purpose after acting heroically, or a person might have that purpose. Because of that purpose, they might find themselves in a situation to be a hero. That being said, someone might be like prepared to be a hero, or a hero in waiting, or a hero in training. They might have all the skills and abilities. Let's say you have first aid training, you're a really strong swimmer. You might be willing to, say, jump into a fast-moving current and save someone. But if you never come up to that situation, you might never actually have to act heroically. And so most people, it's kind of like that. They go through life and they don't reach a time when they have to be heroic. So that's one reason it's hard to find heroes, because not everybody has a chance to be heroic, or it has the skills necessary to meet the heroism required at any given time. Yeah. All right. So now that we have most students here in class, let's jump into chapter 14, and we will start talking about stages in the lifespan, midlife crises, and we'll talk about generativity. So generativity, we've mentioned this quite a few times before, is essentially your desire to leave a legacy to the next generation. And this can come across in a couple different ways. It can be related to your purpose. It could be related to your work, other aspects that are meaningful to you, just your family in general, which probably would be meaningful. So Erikson thought at this time in life, you had either generativity or stagnation. Stagnation is when an adult doesn't feel like they have been generative. And he thought that if you didn't have that chance, if you didn't do something to be generative, you're kind of just had a lower well-being, disappointed for a lot of the rest of your life. You kind of had to reach that generativity to move on to next stages in life. So, as with a lot of things we've talked about with Erikson, some good observations. A lot of middle adults are being generative, but it's not so much of a crisis as Erikson had thought. There's a lot of different ways to be generative. It can be a struggle for someone if they feel like they're not being generative. So let's talk about that. There's many different ways to be generative. So one is simply biological. So having offspring, having your literal genetic material going on to the next generation. So children, grandchildren, that can help people feel like they've been generative. One of the more common ones, well, all of these are pretty common actually. Parental generativity. So this is nurturing and guiding a child. It doesn't even have to be your own child. It can be someone you've adopted. It could also be someone you're just mentoring in kind of like a mentor or apprentice or even a parent and child way. So it doesn't have to be your own child, but you can get this parental generativity by passing on guidance to the next generation. Another common one is work generativity. So maybe you've built skills over decades of time and you're passing on those skills, those specific expertise. One example of this, there's a couple of YouTubers I watch that have been car maintenance people for 30, 40, 50 years. So now one thing that they do, they have their own shop that essentially they own everything and they only take certain jobs. They don't do as much work as they might have before, and a lot of things for their family. So now they make videos to help other people learn how to do basic maintenance and even more complex maintenance items. So it's one way that they're passing their skills on is by literally putting up tutorials on how to do certain things on YouTube. Another example of this would be a mentor and their apprentice. So passing on specific skills. So if you've been in programming for decades, you might have specific tricks or techniques that a new person doesn't know. You might pass that on. An example that I've experienced is one of the faculty members that I work with has been working in scale development for decades. And so one thing that they really like to do is pass on their little tips and tricks to do measurement better in psychology. And so they get a lot of well-being from sharing that with their students or people that they work with, like in their labs. So that's another example of work generativity. So work generativity can kind of overlap with parental generativity. Essentially, you're passing on your specific expertise. You could pass on a specific skill you have, like playing chess, or there's a lot of things that could go into that. Maybe teaching piano or something could be another aspect. Cultural generativity is another really common one, leaving aspects of your culture. Whether that's you are hosting in middle adulthood, you are hosting cultural celebrations, you are teaching people about the culture, you're sharing it in different ways, maybe doing specific rituals or parties or things to help people learn and see what it's like, and keeping that going to share that with the next generation. So those are some of the most common aspects of generativity: biological, parental, work, and cultural, but there's other ways to be generative as well. So when you are being generative, it's correlated with a lot of positive benefits. So people who are being generative, they tend to have higher well-being, less stress, they tend to be more connected to people in their communities or like other people generally. So there's a lot of positive things for being generative. So it's something that we like to focus on, especially in middle adulthood, is trying to help people be generative as developmental scientists. So with what you know about generativity, how would you advise a middle-aged woman who has never had children and fears she has little opportunity to leave a legacy? What are some things you might recommend she do to feel generative? What are some things she might already be doing that she doesn't see as generative? So how would you advise this middle-aged woman who has never had children and fears she has little opportunity to leave a legacy? Feel free to take over the mic or also type a response as well. So what do we think here? Anything we could give for advice for this person who is not sure if they're being generative or what they can do to be generative? Sounds like they are worried about not having children, but we did just talk about other ways to be generative. So what are some things that you advise? If this was your mother or grandmother, or a friend of yours, what would you say to this person? Well, I guess in this case, she doesn't have children, so it wouldn't be a mother or grandmother. If this is a person that you know, that you see at work, what might you say to this person? Yeah, good ideas there. So volunteering could be an option. So while she might be focused on having literal offspring to raise, there's ways that she could volunteer. So another comment is getting involved in something at the community at a school or something to do with kids. That would be a good idea, maybe specifically since she's worried about children and focused that way. Volunteering in that specific kind of realm would be good. So libraries, schools, museums, things like that could be really good. There might also, so really good suggestions there of new things that she could be doing. There are probably things she's already doing that are generative that she just might not consider generative, that she's passing on cultural ideas to other people, or that she is already mentoring people in specific skills and expertise that she has. So helping see that. So really good ideas, volunteering and getting involved, as well as helping this person realize there's other ways that are probably being generative already, can help boost that self-efficacy as well as self-esteem, then follows self-efficacy and well-being. So good ideas. So generativity, like I mentioned, is correlated with well-being, positive engagement with the community, people around you, better health, and wisdom. So if you're passing on your knowledge and your expertise in an area, advice, things like that, you will feel more wise. People will often see you as more wise as well. And civic engagement is really highly correlated with generativity. So civic engagement is its own specific sphere of research within developmental literature. And it overlaps a lot with pro-social behavior. It overlaps a lot with generativity. To be civically engaged is to be kind of involved in civic activities in your community. This often initial research was on specifically like being involved in local government, and that's still related. So voting behaviors are some that are measured with civic engagement, but also being involved in local clubs or groups or organizations. So civic engagement and generativity are highly correlated, but you can be civically engaged and not actually be being generative. But oftentimes for middle adults who are being civically engaged, they are being generative. So let's talk about some of the research in middle adulthood. It really didn't start until recently. So one of the first looks at middle adulthood was Livingston's Seasons of a Man's Life. And so some of the first research was published in the 70s. So this is not very long ago, but we've come a long way since this. So a lot of this book was written based on the interview with just 40 men. So middle-aged men, most likely based on the time period, although I'm not positive, most likely these were all white men. So 40 people, and that's a small sample. So when you're trying to make generalizations about people in general, you probably have had classes in high school or college where there's more than 40 people in that class, right? So 40 people is not a ton. I mean, it's quite a few to like manage in a class, even in a lecture hall. But it's not a whole lot of people. So when you're doing qualitative studies, like the interviews done for this piece of research, you should expect a little bit smaller samples than if you're, say, doing a survey. A survey of middle-aged men, probably a number of 2,000 of diverse people would probably be a good place to start to get some general answers. If you're doing interviews, 40 is still a pretty small number, but I mean, this was early on in the research process. So I would say, but you can imagine if you have an hour or 2 hour interview with 40 people, that's a lot of hours. So 2 hours times 40, That's quite a few hours. So qualitative research and doing interviews does take longer. You tend to get more in-depth information that you can pull from and figure out things from. So it's a good place to start also when you're trying to look at, well, what is people's experience of life? Well, you ask people, what is your experience like? So that's one area qualitative research can be really good for. Then after that, you can start to build ideas or find patterns, build hypotheses. So qualitative research isn't always like a first step in studying a field, but it's often a first step in studying a specific area or field or domain. So a lot of research and purpose in life initially was interviews. And now we have created measures that we can use as surveys to get more data more quickly, try to influence people's purpose in life, make it go up. I mean, I guess you could try to make it go down, but generally we're trying to make it go up because of its positive benefits. So a lot of areas of psychology start with like qualitative in their exploration, but you can do qualitative studies at any time or quantitative studies at any time. Just depends what kinds of things you're trying to look at. So hopefully this sounds a little familiar to you from chapters like 1 and 2. So kind of calling back to that. So some of the common themes they found through these interviews were a concern with being old versus being young. We've talked about even more recent research shows that people tend to feel younger than their actual chronological age, being destructive versus constructive. So this goes in with generativity. Are they providing things to other people or not? Being masculine versus feminine was a concern. Attached to others versus separate from them. So essentially socio-emotional concerns. Are they building relationships? This might be related to things like meaning and purpose and generativity as well. And then how their success depended on how effectively a person was combining a lot of aspects of continuums into their own life. So a lot of their own individual satisfaction was based on how they were using skills and abilities, talents, and their own personalities. So some similarities from there to what we see now. So with that, though, this was a small sample. It was an initial look into it. So it's a good thing that we started someplace, right? That's what I want to get across here. But we've done a lot more research since. So later research found differences at different age times, right? So we're actually going to jump over here. Early adult transition, age 17 to 22. We've talked about that in early adulthood. And then entering a life structure for early adulthood. The idea was that in between 22 and 28, you're kind of making some decisions to transition into middle adulthood. Then age 28 to 33, you've maybe made some of those transitions. And then now by about age 40, you have kind of a more consistent pattern, maybe a little more stability. And then you are now kind of feel like a middle adult, and it's pretty stable until about age 60, where some health problems might arise. Declines of cognitive faculties might start to happen if you're not working on those. So these are some of the ideas of how we should break up middle adulthood, well, early and middle and late adulthood that we started to come to. So transition from just one study of a bunch of men to now we see, oh, there's some similarities of these different age times. And then now we have a lot more research on specific aspects of middle adulthood, like midlife crises. So how pervasive are they? Well, not very much. So they aren't very pervasive. The 40s are really a time when people are still can change their identity. So reassessing and recording or reordering truth about adolescence and adulthood. So this might sound similar to the first time you figure out your identity. You're looking for consistency across your lifespan, consistency across context. You're doing that same thing in the 40s. You're doing the same thing in the 30s and the 50s and the 60s. So this is midlife crises are very overlapping with identity. And so if we see someone make a change or do something, it might seem out of the norm. But really very few people experience a midlife crisis, like a real big crisis where they feel really down about changes they've made in their lives or that they haven't been generative. Very few people actually have that. The changes that we see can actually be more attributed to just general identity development. If they now have parents who are passing away, that's going to change their identity, who they feel they are. If they now have children or grandchildren, that will change how they feel they are. Maybe now they have a little more disposable income, so they can buy a big truck or a faster car, or a second motorcycle finally at some point in their life. That's going to be my mark of being more financially stable, having 2 motorcycles. But then when I have 2, I'll want a third, because that's the rule of motorcycles. You always want one more than you have. So right now I've got 1, so I want a second. Then once I have that second, I'll probably want a third. So we'll see. With this, only a minority of middle adults actually do experience this as a crisis. Really, the things that we see as a crisis are normal identity development. So let's actually watch this example of a person talking about their lived experience, their crises, and I hope you'll be able to see that tie-in to identity development and how this changed for this person over time. And I'm going to watch it at a little quicker speed, so if it's hard to hear or understand, definitely let me know and I can slow it down.
And the literal I'm a brand strategist and a designer. I'm also a white guy in his 40s with receding salt and pepper hair who drives a fast car. The very first time that I ever felt the painful grip of midlife crisis was in 1984. I was 13, sitting in my room, listening to a Doors record, and it dawned on me that Jim Morrison, one of my heroes, had died at age 27. In fact, a lot of my artist heroes had died at 27. This was not good because I was 13 and a half, and I realized that if I were to only live to 27, I was already halfway there. For a couple of weeks, this put me into a real slump. My next midlife crisis came when I was a couple years out of college. I guess I was halfway to 50 at this point, which, by the way, is an age at which a lot of other heroes had died young. But 50 is not what bothered me at this time. It was 35, because that was only 10 years away, and I knew that once I hit 35, I was over the hill. So that put me into a funk again for a short time. My next midlife crisis, though, came at 40 and a half. I had successfully crossed the threshold of 40 with very little drama or chaos. I was proud of this. But then, one beautiful December morning, my dad died. Suddenly and unexpectedly. There's my dad. 66 and in great health, and then he was just gone. And that was so tough, because now one of my greatest heroes, if not my greatest hero, was gone, but also I was for the first time really looking death in the face and seeing it stare right back at me. Okay, so if you're thinking to yourself, this guy sounds a little confused about what a midlife crisis is, you're right, but so are you, because midlife crisis doesn't mean what you think it means. By definition, a midlife crisis is a dip in a person's satisfaction with their life and in their self-confidence. This dip happens about halfway through our life expectancy. That is not what the term midlife crisis has come to mean in our contemporary culture. Most of the time that term is used, we're talking about someone, a person who's engaged in irresponsible, immature, sometimes even destructive behavior. Example, I can't believe your husband's leaving you for a 25-year-old yoga instructor. How does that happen? Well, clearly he's going through a midlife crisis, right? Now, to a brand strategist like me, when there is such a disconnect between what something is and what something is perceived as, that is a branding problem. And it's a problem worth trying to solve. Now, most of the people that I've worked with on brand identity.
So one thing that I want to point out here too is, one, his expertise. So he's mentioned a couple times, he's a brand strategist, he's a designer. So we can see in his thinking about this, about a midlife crisis, he comes at it from the angle of his expertise as a brand strategist. So some of the solutions he's thinking about around it are brand strategist type of ideas. So he might be using creative thinking within that realm. It might be a different way that you would look at it because you might have a different expertise. But this is really common for our own expertise to be a lens through which we view problems, the world, things like that. So I think of things in a sense of research and lifespan development and applied research and evaluating things. So that's how I take a look at social problems or challenges or things like that. and it's going to be different because my expertise is different than this person's. So, but you probably have a different expertise. And so the way you look at it and solve problems and think about things is going to be related to that. So an interesting connection, because we've been talking about creativity, we've been talking about expertise in last week. So another connection there that I just wanted to point out.
They actually don't really know what their problem is. Like, they might know that something's a little bit off with their business, but they can't quite put a finger on it. I have two theories about businesses and identity crises. The first is that whether they realize it or not, they're probably going through one right now. The second is that even if they are, it can be the best thing that ever happened to them. So what do we do when we rebrand? Well, we start by having the company ask themselves a series of questions. Questions like, who are we? And what do we stand for? What is it that makes us unique? Who do we need to be talking to? And what do we need to say?
So I know I'm pausing again and making another connection to research methods, but we talked a little bit earlier about qualitative research and how to do qualitative research. One thing that you will do oftentimes to figure out people's identity is essentially ask them a series of questions to figure out what is consistent about their life, have them basically spell out over the course of talking about their life story, what is their identity right now. So questions like, who are we and what do we stand for is kind of the main point. It might not be the first question you ask, but you might ask a series of questions about what they're interested in, what they are engaged with, what's important to them, those kinds of things. And then if you feel like you've got a pretty good sense of it with an adolescent or an adult, you might say, so what do you stand for? Or who would you say you are? Or what is it that makes you unique? So these kinds of questions, and it is one of his final points to like ask ourselves these questions. But that's one thing a researcher might do to get a sense of someone's identity. And you might see how that might lead to seeing change in identity over time as well with these methods. Because the things that make us unique, that we feel make us unique, that might change over time. The things that are most important to us at any given time might change over time. So this is why identity is changing. There might be aspects that are completely stable across your entire adult lifespan, but there might also be things that change there. All right, so I think that's my last methods tangent for this video.
Companies who rebrand and go about it the right way come out stronger and more successful on the other side. Think about Target. When they had their impressive rebirth, if you will, they asked themselves those same kinds of questions, right? And dialed into exactly who they wanted to be. And then they just focused everything on communicating that clearly and effectively. My big problem with the term midlife crisis is that it's communicating the wrong thing. And as a result, it is a conversation ender, like every time it's used, which sucks because it should be a conversation starter. So how did we get here? Well, the term was coined in 1965 by a psychoanalyst who was obsessed with creative geniuses, like these guys. And he was specifically obsessed with why so many of them seemed to flame out creatively, really young, sometimes before they were even 30, which is crazy because that's not what midlife crisis means at all now. You know, it's very possible that this term is just a misnomer, which is an inaccurate or inappropriate name. But hey, lots of things are misnomers. Chinese checkers are not checkers. They're also not from China. Koala bears are not bears. Coconuts are not nuts. French fries are from Belgium. French horns are from Germany. But these terms, they stick. We get used to them, and the literal meaning of these words tends to fall away most of the time. And if there's no problem, it's not causing any distress, then there's really no point in changing them. I mean, we don't need to rebrand French fries, right? But what about killer whales? Aha! There's a misnomer that's actually doing some harm. First, they're not whales. Second, they're one of the gentlest of all sea creatures, but the negativity in their name has created a stigma, which is perpetuating all kinds of negative feeling towards them. These guys, I would love to help. But later. Right now, I want to help us. Those of us who've been similarly stigmatized with this awful midlife crisis term. Or more importantly, those of us who occasionally experience a dip in our satisfaction with our lives and self-confidence. Because I know a lot of people like that. But interestingly, I kind of feel like I know more millennials that fit that description than people around my own age, right? But that's the thing about this kind of dip. I mean, it happens to teenagers, when psychology will label that an identity crisis. It happens to 46-year-olds, it happens to 66-year-olds, it happens to 27-year-olds. Remember when I said that the term was coined in 1965? Well, it didn't start being used by people really until later, about 1980, after a respected Yale psychologist named Daniel Levinson used it in his book, The Seasons of a Man's Life, which was a groundbreaking treatise on the different life phases that we go through as humans and the dips that accompany each of those phases. But here's the thing, it's not just humans. A 2012 study on hundreds of great apes found that they experience these life dips too. So it's a natural expected phenomenon, not just a factor of our crazy lives and our environment, probably of our biology. My question is, why does it have to be a crisis? I mean, we know what a crisis is, right? Does this have to be so extreme? I mean, look, we're all different, right? We're unique, every one of us. The dips that we experience are going to be different too. For some people, maybe it's just a phase where perhaps you're a little bit more reflective than normal, but otherwise fairly normal. Some people do go off the rails, as noted, but most people, of course, are going to fall somewhere in between. Okay, one last thing that nearly every study in this area has shown is that this kind of dip ends. Assuming there's no mental illness present, the dip eventually corrects itself, and a person's life satisfaction and self-confidence is almost always higher on the other side of this dip. So for that reason, most of the people in the scientific world are starting to think about these dips as more of a wave, which makes sense, because that's what our lives are. We sail across these oceans of waves, right? There's highs, there's dips. Some are bigger than others. At any point, we are just on the trajectory of a wave. Look, maybe when we are in a dip, that's a good time for us to ask ourselves a series of questions. Questions like, who are we? And what do we stand for? Can we embrace what makes us unique? And maybe most importantly, who do we need to be talking to? And what do we need to say to them? Because now I'm developing a couple of theories about people. The first is that whether you realize it or not, you could be going through a midlife crisis right now. The second is that even if you are, it could be the best thing that ever happened to you. Killer whales are not whales. They're dolphins. Your funny bone is not a bone, it's a nerve. A midlife crisis is not a reason to end a conversation. It's a reason to start one. Thank you.
So I like the examples given in that about the development over time and the things, this specific individuals, their experience where they felt they had that midlife crisis. Because, I mean, in some ways, you could call that an, oh goodness, what's the term? Existential crisis even. But the point is really good that people in general, we have times that are more positive, times that are more negative, but in general, over the course of the lifespan, people's trajectory of well-being is going up. So yes, there might be times when you don't feel as good, maybe you don't feel like you're being as generative. In general, though, people across, in average, have their well-being going up throughout their adult life. And then there are changes. There are changes that happen throughout life. So let's talk about some of those changes and some of those variations. Most people, it's not as big of a challenge or crisis like he's mentioning. So we now have the contemporary life events approach, and you'll probably see some similarities with some of the other approaches that we've talked about. So essentially, this is the idea, this is not just in relation to midlife crises, this is also any life event. So if you have an accident, so say a car accident, maybe you lose the use of one of your limbs. That is a life event, and based on it, how you approach it is going to depend on some other context in your environment. So some specific examples might be the life event itself. What is it? Is it an accident? Let's go with that example. Or is it something like the birth of a child? So what are the mediating factors? So here are some examples of mediating variables. Your physical health. If you were already pretty physically healthy, losing the use of one of your limbs to an accident might not be as bad of an impact. If you have family supports, maybe you have people in your family who don't have use of some of their limbs. Maybe they can give you direct support, direct tips, an extra wheelchair or something like that. Income, if you're still able to do your job, that's going to depend or be a big factor of how you respond to this new life event. So also, do you have certain adaptations that are going to make it easier to get through this or more challenging? How resilient are you? What is the socio-historical context? So are you in an environment where let's say you are in a wheelchair. Let's say you've been in an accident, you've now lost the use of one of your limbs, now you have to be in a wheelchair a lot of the time. Are you in an environment where there's a lot of accessibility for you? So ramps, elevators, properly leveled things so that you can still reach them when you're not able to stand. So you're probably going to be better off and respond to this, be more resilient than if those things aren't in place. And then also your life stage context as well. So there's all these contexts that are affecting how you respond to these life events. So this could be a challenge. This could be an accident. This could be something like a marriage or having a partner die. This could be something like not feeling like you're being generative in midlife. So Another specific example, if a person's in poor health, in poverty, has little family support, the life event of losing a friend will lead to different outcomes than if they have the opposite. If they're in good health, not in poverty, have a lot of family support, they'll probably be able to be a little more resilient to that. So the life events approach is looking at other contexts and how it might affect how we can bounce back from things that might be challenges. This should sound pretty similar to this model, but Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model of human development, looking at an individual with their own individual factors. They have their own school network, friend network, workplace network, neighborhood, family networks. So this is the microsystem, those people they interact with on a day-to-day basis. They're in a specific system, so the political system, the economic system, the government, the community. Are there the ramps in buildings to get the wheelchair up? And what are the norms and values of a culture? For an accident, it's probably norms that aren't necessarily stigmatizing that, but maybe your identity is different than other people in the majority. And so maybe there's some stigma against that, right? So there's a lot of aspects that go into the development of these people over time. It's also really similar to Lerner's developmental contextual model and the developmental cascades. So this is where we've essentially gone to, rather than these stage-like aspects of life over adolescence, early adulthood, middle adulthood, late adulthood, that there's a lot of times more capacity for change and development. Optimal development is what I focus on. Other researchers focus on possible negative outcomes. So there's a lot of change at this time in life still, more than you might have thought of in the past, more than researchers thought of in a couple decades ago. They were still very focused on the stability of this time. And it is true that there are a lot of stability aspects during this time. We'll come back to personality. I want to jump back to this in a second. So here, over time, in middle adulthood, especially in relation to socio-emotional factors, people get better at interacting in their environment, within their context, in ways that promote more stability. So you are in now a long-term job, you have the friends that you've had for many years, you're probably in a little more of a routine. So there's more stability in that. You're probably seeing about the same people, doing about the same things. So there tends to be more stability at midlife. But that doesn't mean that other aspects don't change. Having a parent die, having a child have a grandchild, losing a job. So there are aspects that might change totally randomly. There might be things that become more important to somebody. Maybe they realize this hobby that they've been doing for many years isn't as important to them anymore. They're not engaged with it as much. It's not as meaningful. So they switch to a new hobby. So these are things that can and do happen a lot. While there does tend to be a little more stability across middle adulthood, one thing I want to get across to all students who are going through a lifespan development course is there's a lot of change over the lifespan. So social context, new experiences, socio-historical changes can all make changes in a person's life. So personality, even though we're going to talk about it as being a little more stable in just a second, there is still plasticity in that. And we'll come back to this slide actually after we go through personality. So let's talk about the Big Five personality scale. What are some personality? Has anyone ever done a personality test? I guess is my main question. Do you remember what it was called? Do you remember what your score was? So if you've ever done a personality test, it might have been for like just a school assignment. It oftentimes might have been for a job, or like say in the job interview process. Maybe you did a personality test. Has anyone ever done a personality test, and then what kind was it, or what was your kind of score or outcome on it? You might recognize Big Five personality traits. You might recognize, I keep thinking McGraw-Hill, but that's her book. Myers-Briggs started with M. That's why I was thinking McGraw-Hill. Myers-Briggs, you might have done that personality test. Has anyone done that? Let me know what your responses were what your personality was and what the kind of test it was. Has anyone ever done one of those kind of silly personality tests, like which Hogwarts house are you kind of thing? Anything to kind of do with your personality, which Avenger are you like, or which Avatar The Last Airbender character are you? Have you ever done any of those kinds of personality assessments? And then what did it make you think of in relation to how accurate was it? Things like that. Interesting. We've got a couple students who have done a color personality test. So was this, can you give a little more description on these? It might be the same kind of test. Were you looking at colors, or like you answered questions about yourself, like multiple choice, and then it gave you your classification was colors? Or were you looking at colors and like picking which colors you preferred? Okay, so you were responding to questions about yourself, and then the output, like it's saying your personality type is like blue orange or something like that. So it gave you colors that described you and gave you a description. So for Nicole, it was pretty accurate, you felt like. So can you remember any of the kinds of questions that it asked you at all? Even just like a general sense. It definitely doesn't have to be like word for word. And so statements, and you rated yourself out of 5, and then it gave you a color that matched. Okay, so you're responding to statements in a Likert type scale, agree to disagree kind of thing. Interesting. And then it gave you some 2 colors that matched your personality. So, and then you remember, Caitlin remembers theirs of being blue and orange. And then one of the students was in a criminal justice class, and that's what they did. Interesting. So tests like that are actually really common in, say, business settings to try and figure out which personality types should be working together well. So you might do, say, the Myers-Briggs is a really commonly used one in business. A color personality test, I would need to see the actual like name of it to be sure which one it is, because they could definitely, for any personality test, whether it's the Costa-McCrae or anything else, they could associate colors with different things. So I wonder which theory it's based on, or if it's just random looking at it. But one thing with these kinds of personality assessments is personality theory originally was supposed to look at these traits, and then you were supposed to be those traits across lots of different situations. So if you're extroverted, you would be expected to be extroverted across all sorts of situations. What later researchers have found is that that's not really the case, that your statements about yourself can change versus the situation. Interesting. a difficult person test, and you got a 53%. So you're about halfway there between being a difficult person and an easy to get along with person then. So, but that's good that that's a continuum. And it sounds like that difficult person actually correlates a little bit with one of the big five aspects or axes. So interesting. So think about those kinds of tests that you've done and how accurate or inaccurate it was. Because interestingly, a lot of personality assessments that are widely used, whether it's in a criminal justice kind of system or in businesses, a lot of businesses actually use the Myers-Briggs personality assessment, and it's really not good. It's not a very valid measure. The scores aren't used how they should be used. So a lot of personality theory has kind of moved past some of those scales and some of those categorizations. One of the ones that we use most often now is Costin-McRae's Big Five. So with this, there's essentially 5 dimensions of your personality, and we'll talk about those in this video, give some examples of when you're high or low on it. So conscientiousness, for example, is one of the big 5. So you're either high in conscientiousness or low in conscientiousness. So we'll hear some examples here and then talk about how well or not very well it lines up with actual lived experience. But good, I'm glad you've got some senses and we have some examples of personality tests. Whether or not they're these ones or other ones, it's good to have that as to understand this topic.
The field of psychology has been trying to understand all those personality traits that make you a unique and special little snowflake. Hi guys, I'm Lacey Green, and this is D News. It's called personality psychology, and it's a booming field of research you're bound to hear about in any human psych class. One of the most well-researched and respected personality models in the field is Costin-McRae's Big Five. This model evaluates how strong a person is on 5 different axes. Let's take a look-see at those traits. Trait number 1 is openness to experience. This trait describes how open or closed your thinking is. Highly open people are intellectually curious. They love art and science. Open people appreciate emotion, unusual ideas, imagination, adventure, and of course, having new experiences. People with low scores tend to have more traditional interests. They prefer familiarity over doing something new, and they don't really like change. Trait number 2 is conscientiousness. Highly conscientious people are basically those annoying overachievers who are always on top of it. They're disciplined, responsible, and good at planning ahead. A high score on conscientiousness suggests a strong ability to regulate and control your behavior. Low scores tend to be more impulsive and unorganized. You know, hot mess status. Trait number 3 is extroversion. People tend to think of extroversion and introversion as how outgoing you are, but it's actually about how you get your energy. High scorers, the extroverts, feel recharged and energized by going out and being around people. They like parties and chit-chatting. Low scorers or introverts feel rejuvenated and energized by spending time alone. They tend to be quieter, lower key, and more deliberate. They go to a party and they have to recover the next day. This is sometimes confused with shyness, but shyness is about comfort socializing. Introversion and extroversion are about the amount of socializing you need to do your best and to feel your best. Trait number 4 is agreeableness. Highly agreeable people are considerate, friendly, and helpful. They just wish we could all get along, guys. They make sacrifices for others, and they assume others are good people. Low scorers or highly disagreeable people are suspicious, distant, and uncooperative. They place self-interest above getting along. They don't care as much about other people's well-being, and they're less likely to help you out. Basically, they're assholes. I'm just kidding, but really. And last but not least, trait number 5 is neuroticism. This trait measures emotional stability. Highly neurotic people are more prone to negative emotions like anxiety, anger, depression. They're easily stressed out, they're reactive, and they're more likely to be frustrated in day-to-day life. Low scorers are more calm and collected. It was thought that these 5 traits held true across regions and cultures. We've witnessed them in action across the world, but recently, researchers found an isolated Bolivian farming community where for the first time, it doesn't seem to apply. For this community, there are only 2 major traits: socially beneficial behavior, and industriousness. This makes an interesting suggestion about personality. If there are less developed areas where personality trends are different, society may play a stronger role in encouraging or discouraging the expression of personality traits than we once thought. Food for your brain. So guys, I'm going to put a link in the description.
So if you want to do a Big Five personality assessment, it's in the link down there, so you can click through to that. Sorry, I accidentally hung up while I was trying to click between conversations and participants, checking on comments if there's anything new, and I accidentally hung up. I think I came right back in, so you probably only missed a couple seconds of that, because I don't think it would have kept sending my video and audio. So sorry about that. That is totally my mistake. But I think you got all the examples of things like openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. So these are the dimensions of the Big Five. So the difficult person test would probably go along pretty well with either agreeableness or conscientiousness, the one that Nicole was taking. So that kind of test might suggest where you were on that spectrum. So some personality assessments like the Myers-Briggs, it's really popular, but it's not very good, will give you a key code like INFJ or something like that, and kind of put you just in one category and class. But really, most people on any given construct are somewhere in the range. They're not far to like one extreme or the other. So a lot of personality assessments kind of said if you got like above average on this, you were that thing. And that's not what is done for the Big Five, which is one reason why it's better, because it allows for more of that flexibility. So you could be a 53% on difficult person, and then you could compare other people who are around 53% on difficult person and correlate that across different situations. So personality tried to look at these general traits and assume that they would be the same across different situations. So when you're at school versus you're at work versus you're at home versus you're out with friends, if you're an open person, you will have similar kinds of behaviors in all those different situations. But what we found is that that's not actually the case. The social situation, the social factors and pressures, and the social context has a bigger impact than we used to think in personality psychology. Other developmental factors, like your identity, have another big impact. Your previous behaviors as well. So with that, personality psychology has kind of been absorbed into social and developmental psychology. You can still find people who are personality psychologists, but there's a ton of overlap with social psych. There's a ton of overlap with developmental psych. It's kind of been absorbed in a lot of ways. But this is a better model. It does tend to hold pretty true across different cultures. At the end of that video there, about when I accidentally shut it off, did talk about there's specific places we found that this doesn't necessarily hold up, that all 5 of these traits are really relevant. But overall, it's a better model of personality. But one thing, when you have really broad traits like conscientiousness and openness and neuroticism, when it's that broad, it does make it hard to predict specific behaviors. So if we know you're a 53% on agreeableness, a 70% on conscientiousness, a 80% on openness, we might be able to look at similarities with people with similar scores across different situations. But when you try to put someone in a brand new situation that's different than what you've seen before, their behavior doesn't always line up. So while you might be open in a bunch of contexts, you might not be open in all contexts. Maybe in your work setting, you're not really open to new ideas. So in that specific context, even though in all other aspects of your life, you're a very open person. So this is one problem with personality psychology, trying to focus on that stability, is that there is a lot of change. And so that's one big key that I want to get across in lifespan development, is that yes, there might be things that are stable across the lifespan. But we shouldn't exclude things that are changing too, but we also shouldn't exclude things that are stable. We need to do better at measuring things that are both changing and stable across the lifespan to understand human experience better. So things like intellectual orientation, self-confidence, openness to a new experience were more stable traits in a longitudinal study. So those stayed pretty consistent through adulthood. But being more nurturant or hostile, that changed a lot through adulthood. So maybe the birth of a child or a grandchild made a big change in whether you were more nurturant or hostile. Self-control had a dramatic change too. So people's emotion regulation can improve if they're not trying to regulate emotions or have more self-control. That can change. So while that might be something, for example, I was actually talking to my mom about developing of like the grandchildren and my experience through life. And some of the things that she would say suggest that she thought, well, you get to the capacity of having self-control, then you keep that. And that used to be an idea in a lot of fields of psychology as well. Once you get to that capacity, you gain that capacity, you keep it. In general, that tends to be fairly stable for a lot of people, but it's not necessarily. So self-control is something that people might still need to work on, things to practice, you can still improve on. So versus self-confidence, intellectual orientation, and openness tended to be more stable across the lifespan. So more recent research suggests that some of our preconceived notions of things that were stable or changed aren't actually the case. And that's really good. So then we can help people to still develop optimally within their life. Some of these points. So yes, back to this, plasticity and personality and identity. So we've talked a lot about identity and how that's more plastic than we tended to think. I think we've got that point across enough. But personality originally was intended to look at these 5 traits or 20 traits. There was some researchers in personality who had as many as like 800 different specific traits. And if you could have 800 specific traits and predict on those, that could be really a lot more useful at predicting in specific behaviors. But they found that across context, things might be different. So there is more plasticity than we might have originally thought a couple decades ago across midlife. Now, that being said, measurement tools that focus on measuring change over time haven't always been the best at also measuring stability over time. If the measure is designed to measure change, it can do a good job at measuring change. I'm not going to get too much into like the statistics and design of measures for this. But if you're asking questions in an interview setting that are trying to pull out if someone has changed on something, even if someone hasn't changed on something, you might tend to get that from those questions. Is maybe one example there. So the field right now is kind of at a crossroads. Yes, we see all these changes, but any individual might have stability. So we're trying right now to develop really good measures to be able to measure that stability as well as measuring that change, as well at the same time to measure this across cultures. Because yeah, we recognize that, hey, focusing on just a sample of 40 middle-aged white men is probably not the best way to learn about adult development worldwide. We're trying to make better measures that have measurement invariance. They don't change when you use it in this culture versus this culture. So one of the scales of purpose that I developed with a team, we recently ran some measurement invariance analysis with young people essentially in between the ages of 18 and 35 across a couple different places in the Western world. So still the Western world, but outside of just the US. And we saw that it still worked in all those samples. It was still valid. It was still getting the kind of data, and that it was still working pretty well. But there were some ways that we need to interpret the data differently in relation to other people around the world. So if we continue doing that, testing this one measure in multiple cultures, we might find, well, it might not work in some areas. Maybe the questions aren't really good to get at purpose in that area. So figuring out similarities and differences in people, looking at stability and change over time. Part of this is a methods problem, but I think we know and we're trying to work on it. So other aspects that are changing at this time, let's definitely talk about this, is close relationships. So let's focus on a couple. We've talked a lot about immediate partners in earlier times. let's talk about sibling and friendships in middle adulthood. So again, we're focused here on middle adults who might have siblings or friends. So sibling relationships tend to be fairly stable throughout middle adulthood, but they can be on a big continuum. You might have sibling relationships that are really close, and they will tend to stay pretty close. You might have sibling relationships that are really apathetic. You're not really concerned with what the sibling is doing. Or you might have sibling relationships that are highly rivalrous. So you're still having sibling rivalry even in middle adulthood. And that will tend on average to stay the same. It doesn't have to though. Again, different things might change. Maybe a parent dies, you have to come together. Now you're no longer rivalrous. Now you're really close because of that situation that happened. Definitely an example of something that could happen. Friendships that have endured into these middle adult years, so things that have started even possibly in childhood or early adulthood or even in middle adulthood, long-term friendships are rated as with more satisfaction, are rated as being more deep than even sibling relationships. So a sibling can be a friend that's this close, but oftentimes for middle adults, the people that they're actually closest to are long-term friends, that they feel they have a deeper connection with these individuals. So something that, one reason why I wanted to focus one of the extra credit assignments on early adult friendships, because generally that's kind of when they might start and continue on through middle adulthood. So it's an important aspect that isn't as touched on as heavily. So grandparenting has a lot of different kinds of contexts now too. So grandparents are more commonly now than in say 20 or 30 years ago, stepping in as a primary caregiver of children. This might be caused by a death of one of the parents, divorce, adolescent pregnancy, drug use. There's an acquaintance that I have that their husband passed away, and with having to work multiple jobs to support the children, they didn't have the time to have so much direct care of the children, so the grandparents are now the parents of the primary caregivers, like the children live in the grandparents' home. So this is becoming more common in the US. It's not as big of a change in other cultures. As we've talked about in other cultures that might be a little more communal, there might be more interaction between aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents in raising a child. There might be more involvement in a community. So this is something that we've seen in the US. With that, full-time grandparenting is correlated to things like health problems, depression, stress. It's because it is challenging on an older person's body to maybe chase around a 5-year-old who's going in a park. So we've seen that. And as well here in the US, we do have that view that like the parents or like their primary caregivers are so solely responsible and not sharing that responsibility more widely. And a lot of the social institutions that we've built up are kind of around that as well, versus supporting community involvement in parenting as well. So we've got little time, so I'm trying to decide which one of these things to focus on right now. Let's talk about empty nest and its refilling. So the empty nest syndrome is essentially the idea that some people's marital satisfaction decreases after children leave the home. So that was probably a very purposeful activity for both partners to raise those children, to care for them. And now after those children leave and their house is empty, they might have more free time, but because so much of their responsibility was taking care of these children, oftentimes people's marital satisfaction decreases and general satisfaction with life as well. So with that, refilling that emptiness is a pretty common thing to do. So whether it's bringing in, say, older adult parents into that home or encouraging children to come back to live with them, it's a pretty common phenomena to, after the nest gets emptied, to refill it with other people, either those same people, those children, grandchildren, older parents. So that is a fairly common phenomena. With that being said, I'm not trying to say that refilling that or not refilling it is positive or negative. So yeah, it's essentially describing this is a more common phenomenon than we maybe saw earlier on. Other things that I've skimmed over that I want to focus on more before the end of class. We have talked about divorce rates, that more often people are getting married in towards the middle or end of early adulthood, and then by middle adulthood they would have probably already had a divorce. So on average, most married individuals in middle adulthood are satisfied, and they are not getting divorced as often as in early middle adulthood or in late early adulthood. Yeah. So there's a couple more points that I'll probably talk about in more detail with a little more time in chapter 14 before we move on to chapter 15 next time. But with the time we have now, I don't think we have time to dive into those topics yet. So I think we'll stop there for today, just a couple minutes early. So thanks for being here and commenting about personality tests and things like that. Hopefully those examples help it make more sense to you. So have a good rest of your day. I'll see you on Thursday.
Thank you.